They said he came down from the mountain only once a year, scarred by war, untouched by women, eyes like a storm waiting to break. When Elias Boone returned to Redemption Ridge, folks expected violence, not a vow. And when he chose her, the obese mail-order bride left humiliated on the church steps, whispers turned to gasps. Why would a reclusive war hero take in the woman nobody wanted? What secret pain binds the broken to the cast aside? And what storm is coming that will test whether love, not judgment, will win? Stay close now. This ain't the story you think at Island. When a mountain man claims the bride, no one else would, and the town starts whispering, one truth rises like smoke from a cabin fire. Love sees what others choose to ignore. Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded that these stories aren't just about the Old West, they're about us. If you believe in second chances, quiet strength, and the kind of courage that stands tall in silence, then you belong here. Let me know which state you're watching from, give this video a like, and subscribe to help us keep telling stories that honor what truly matters. The noon sun beat down on the red dirt of Redemption Ridge, casting hard shadows across the main road where wagons creaked and boots scuffed without pause. The stagecoach rolled to a stop in front of the post office, and the driver barely tipped his hat before unloading a single, modest trunk and offering a hand to the last passenger. She stepped down carefully, adjusting her hat with trembling fingers. Martha Jane was broad-shouldered, round-faced, and wore a navy traveling dress that strained slightly at the seams. Her cheeks were flushed, not from the heat, but from the feeling of every eye in town turning to her at once. She carried herself with care, with the kind of quiet that comes from years of being noticed only for the wrong reasons. Her boots hit the ground softly, her breath hitching as she scanned the dusty street. Men leaned against storefronts and squinted. A few women peered through lace curtains from the saloon balcony above. Whispers began almost instantly, low, cutting, and sharp. "She's the one? Lord have mercy." And he ordered her. "Ain't right." Martha Jane ignored them as best she could, holding the letter in her gloved hand like a shield. To Miss Martha Jane Rigsby. Care of Judge Wells, Redemption Ridge. She had read it over and over again for days. A man named Carl Tillman had paid for her passage from Missouri, said he needed a good, loyal woman. Someone who wouldn't turn up her nose at homestead life. Someone like her. She approached the courthouse, a weathered building of oak and stone, and stood beneath the porch's shadow. Inside, Judge Wells looked up from his paperwork as the door creaked open. He was an older man with a pinched brow and thinning hair, but his voice was not unkind when he spoke. "You must be Miss Rigsby." "Martha Jane," she answered, nearly in a whisper. "Is Mr. Tillman here?" The judge sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Carl Tillman rode north 4 days ago. Left no word. Far as I know, he won't be returning." Her lips parted, but no sound came. She blinked, once, twice. Then she clutched the letter tighter, its edges now damp in her palm. "I see," she said quietly. The judge rose and came around his desk. "I'm sorry, miss. Some men, well, they speak louder in ink than they do in truth. But you're not to sleep in the street. Sister Abigail at the church can give you a cot for a week." She nodded, numb, and followed his directions with the slow steps of someone walking through a dream. By the time she reached the chapel, the townsfolk had moved on, but the whispers clung to her like dust in the folds of her dress. That evening she sat alone on the edge of the cot, her trunk unopened at her feet. The stained glass windows cast patterns on the wooden floor, and the smell of beeswax and old hymnals filled the room. She held the letter again in her lap, staring at the words until they blurred. She was supposed to be someone's wife by now. She had left behind the only home she knew, her few possessions packed with care. There had been hope in that suitcase, pressed handkerchiefs, jars of preserves, a pair of knitting needles. But now, Martha Jane was just a name spoken in hushed tones, a figure to be pitied or mocked, a woman without a husband, without a plan, and without a place. The church bells tolled 7 times. Outside, the wind picked up dust from the ridge and scattered it across the town like old shame. And inside the chapel, Martha Jane sat alone, holding a promise that had never been real. The sound of hooves echoed down the canyon trail long before the rider appeared. Those who recognized the rhythm of that gait, the slow, deliberate clop of a war-worn mount, turned their heads with a mixture of unease and curiosity. Children were pulled inside. Storefront doors creaked closed. Even the mutts that normally lounged in the shade scattered. By the time the rider crossed the wooden bridge into Redemption Ridge, the main street had grown near silent. Elias Boone rode with the weight of mountains in his shoulders. He was a large man, towering even atop his horse, with a beard gone silver around the edges and skin like dried hide. A jagged scar sliced down the left side of his face, stopping just short of a blind, milky eye. His coat was wool, dark, and stained from weather and blood, old blood. The leather gloves on his hands couldn't hide the way his fingers curled stiffly from old burns. He hadn't been seen in town for nearly 5 winters. And even before that, he hadn't spoken more than a few words since returning from the war. He dismounted in front of the mercantile, tied his horse, and stepped inside with the gait of a man who expected no welcome and wanted none. As he passed, men turned their shoulders, giving him space not out of kindness but fear. Women looked away. Children watched from behind barrels and corners, whispering stories their fathers told in hushed tones, that he once snapped a man's neck without blinking, that he howled in the woods at night, that he buried his dead with his own hands, and never wept. Elias didn't stay long. He bought salt, lye, and flour, and said nothing as coins clinked on the counter. But as he stepped back into the sun, someone, caught his eye. Across the road, sitting on the edge of the church stoop, was a woman. She wore a plain dress and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded her face, but there was no mistaking the curve of her frame, the stillness of her hands, or the way her shoulders slumped, as if carrying the weight of all the laughter she'd never been invited into. She looked lost, discarded, like something too gentle for this place. Martha Jane lifted her eyes and met his gaze, just for a second. Then she looked down again, as if ashamed of being seen. Elias stood there a moment longer, unmoving, while the dust of the street swirled around his boots. Later, at the courthouse, Judge Wells looked up in surprise as the cabin door creaked open and Elias stepped inside. "Well, I'll be," the judge muttered. "Didn't think I'd see you again before snow." Elias said nothing. He approached the desk, rested both gloved hands upon it, and looked the judge dead in the eye. "Is it true?" he asked, voice gravel and grit. "The girl? No one's come for her?" The judge hesitated. "She's got a week. Then I'm putting her on the next coach east. Don't reckon she's got coin left to go anywhere else." Elias looked toward the chapel window, where faint candlelight flickered. Then, with the gravity of a man who'd already buried everything he'd ever loved, he spoke 5 words that silenced the room. "I'll take the girl in." The judge blinked. You mean, as a hand? Or—" Elias didn't answer. He turned and left, boots echoing on the floor like the ticking of a slow clock. Outside, townsfolk watched him pass, whispering anew, but he ignored them. That night, under a harvest moon, Martha Jane heard a knock at the church door. Sister Abigail opened it, and there stood the man from the street, tall, terrifying and still as a stone. He held her gaze with that stormy, broken eye, and spoke gently, without flourish. "You comin'? Sun sets quick up there." And the mite friend, and without quite knowing why, or how, or what future she was stepping toward, Martha Jane rose, took her trunk, and followed the mountain man into the night. The trail wound like a serpent along the ridge, narrowing at times to barely more than a shelf carved into the stone. Pines leaned overhead, their dark arms whispering secrets to one another in the biting wind. The mare Elias had chosen for Martha Jane was gentle, but the ride was no easy task. Her knees ached from gripping the saddle. Her fingers, wrapped in wool gloves, grew stiff with cold. Still, she didn't complain. She clutched the small satchel in her lap and stared straight ahead, her breath coming in short puffs of fog as they climbed higher and higher. Behind her, Elias rode without a word, his presence looming like the trees around them. He didn't look at her, not once. But every so often, she heard him whistle low, and his horse would slow to let hers catch up. When the wind cut sharpest across a clearing, he would reach out to steady her reins. He never spoke, he never smiled, but he watched. Hours passed, and the town below faded from view until only wilderness surrounded them. Snow-patched meadows, skeletal birches, the endless hush of mountain solitude. It was as if they had crossed some invisible threshold where time ceased to matter and only endurance remained. Just before dusk, they reached the edge of a rocky outcropping. Below it sat a small cabin, tucked into the elbow of a hill, its chimney breathing smoke into the twilight. The walls were built from thick, weathered logs, and the shutters were drawn tight. Behind it, the forest loomed, and beyond that, only sky. Martha Jane stared at it with something like awe or maybe fear. Elias dismounted first and came to help her down. She flinched when his hands touched her waist but didn't pull away. His grip was firm and brief. He led her toward the door, boots crunching softly in the snow. She noticed the woodpile stacked with precise care, the sled leaning against the wall, the narrow path cleared to the outhouse. This was no wild man's den. It was tidy, prepared, lived in. Inside, the cabin was warm from the hearth's low fire. A pot simmered on a metal hook. A rough-hewn table stood beneath the window. 2 chairs, 1 bed. A bearskin rug stretched across the floor. He gestured for her to sit, then ladled stew into 2 bowls and set one in front of her. They ate in silence. She glanced at him once, his face etched in shadows, eyes fixed on the flames. He didn't slurp or grunt or fill the air with unnecessary noise. He simply existed, large and still, like the mountain itself. When she finished, she rose, unsure what to do. He pointed to a cot made up near the stove with folded quilts. "You can take that one," he said, voice low. She nodded, removed her boots, slipped beneath the covers. "Later," she cried. Not loudly, not in sobs, just the slow, quiet kind of crying that soaks a pillow and leaves no trace in the morning. She wept for Missouri, for the town, for the groom who never came. She wept for the weight she carried in her bones, and for the silence of this place that mirrored the silence inside her. Elias didn't speak. He didn't come near. Instead, he stepped outside into the cold and sat on the porch, arms resting on his knees, breath clouding before him. Snow began to fall light at first, then steadier. The forest groaned beneath it, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled low. He sat that way for hours, watching the trees sway and the smoke rise from the chimney, listening, thinking, remembering. Inside, the fire crackled and a woman slept alone, unaware that the man outside had once sworn never to let another soul cross his threshold again. But he had, and winter had only just begun. The days in the high mountains followed a rhythm untouched by the town below, quiet, slow, and cold as stone. The sun crested the eastern ridge late and fell behind the pines early, casting the cabin into shadow long before supper. Each morning, Elias rose before first light. Martha Jane would wake to the sound of the door closing, the crunch of his boots fading into the snow. He worked outside with steady hands and few tools, splitting logs, checking traps, repairing the fencing that bordered the clearing like a wooden halo. By the time he returned at dusk, his beard was thick with frost, and his shoulders dusted in white. Martha Jane kept to the cabin. She swept the pine floors, cleaned the soot from the stovepipe, folded their meager linens with careful hands. She baked bread when the flour stretched far enough, and boiled roots into stew when it didn't. She was not lazy, nor loud. She took up little space, though she was large in body and soft around the edges. Her voice, when she used it, was gentle and plain. They did not speak much, only what was needed. "There's tea in the kettle. I'll bring in more wood. Storm comin' tomorrow." Elias would nod or grunt in reply, and sometimes nothing at all. His silences were not cruel, just heavy, like thick wool laid across the chest. He didn't slam doors or bark commands, but neither did he look her in the eye or ask after her day. He stayed on his side of the cabin, and she on hers, like 2 trees grown in the same soil but never bending toward one another. One afternoon, while straightening the shelves near the hearth, Martha Jane noticed something strange. Tucked beneath a stack of old pelts and firewood sat a weathered trunk, its iron hinges rusted, its lid latched tight with a padlock. She hadn't seen Elias approach it. In fact, he seemed to never look in that direction. But once, as she reached to move a nearby pail, she caught him watching from the doorway, not with anger, but with something deeper, grief perhaps, or warning. She let the pail be. Still, Her eyes returned to that trunk often. It seemed out of place in the otherwise sparse and practical room. She wondered what it held. Letters, keepsakes, a past he couldn't part with. She would never ask. Not yet. That night, as snow fell thick and silent outside the window, she spooned stew into their bowls. The fire crackled softly, casting orange across the walls. They sat across from each other, chewing in quiet. She cleared her throat once, unsure. "I was wondering," she said gently, eyes fixed on her bowl, "if I might stay through the winter." Elias didn't look up. He set his spoon down and reached for the kettle, poured a measure of tea into his tin cup. He sipped, then gave a slow nod. Nothing more. It wasn't much. But it was permission. It was enough. Martha Jane folded her hands in her lap and stared into the fire, where shadows danced and logs split softly from heat. Outside, the wind picked up again, whistling through the trees like an old song. Inside, two souls sat on either side of a warm hearth, both strangers still, but tethered now by a thread thin as breath, quiet as snow. The winter deepened. Snow piled high along the cabin walls, muffling the world into silence. Wind whistled down from the ridge like a morning hymn, and the pine trees groaned under their icy burdens. Days blurred into one another, marked only by the rhythm of necessity, wood to chop, stew to stir, water to boil, clothes to mend. Martha Jane found peace in the pattern, even if it was quiet and strange. Elias still spoke little, but something in the air between them had begun to soften, not warm, exactly, but no longer sharp. It started with the woodpile. She had always brought in kindling herself, making small trips to the lean-to with her shawl wrapped tight and her boots sinking into the crusted snow. But one morning, she opened the cabin door and found two fresh armfuls of split pine stacked neatly beside the threshold. Not dumped, not scattered, arranged with care, like someone had thought about it. She glanced over her shoulder to where Elias was oiling a trap on the workbench. He didn't look up. Then came the meat. The larder was usually spare bits of dried venison and what few root vegetables had wintered well. But one afternoon, she returned from scrubbing linens in the creek to find a slab of freshly butchered elk hanging in the smokehouse. It had been skinned, dressed, and hung with twine. No note, no words, just food. Martha Jane pressed her palm to the frost-rimed doorframe and stood a long while before going back inside. She did not mention it. But that night, she made stew richer than usual and placed an extra biscuit beside his bowl. Elias didn't speak, but he ate every bite. In the quiet hours, she began drawing again. It had been years since she'd put charcoal to paper. She tore strips from the brown paper lining her trunk and used burnt twigs to sketch the things she noticed: the curve of icicles on the eaves, the paw prints in snow, the curl of frost on the window pane. Her hand moved slowly at first, unsure, but the shapes came back. Memory lived in her fingertips, and the world seemed to pour through them when her voice could not. One morning, she left a small drawing on the table, just a wildflower, the kind that would bloom near the ridge come spring. When she returned from fetching water, the drawing was gone. In its place sat a clean piece of parchment and a sharper piece of charcoal, likely taken from his workbench. He said nothing. She said nothing, but she drew again the next day. Then came the fox. It limped into the clearing just before dusk, thin, shaking, its hind leg bloody and twisted beneath it. Martha Jane spotted it near the shed, barely upright in the snow. She crouched low and extended a gloved hand, whispering softly as it shivered and watched her with fearful amber eyes. She brought it scraps of meat, then water, then a blanket. Elias stood near the chopping block, tools in hand, watching without a word. She waited for him to raise a protest, to scold her for bringing a wild thing close to the cabin, but he only turned back to his work. She coaxed the fox into the woodshed, made a nest for it from old rags and straw. Each day, she fed it, checked its wound, and hummed while she worked. It never let her touch it, but it stopped trying to leave. Sometimes, when she passed Elias near the porch, she noticed his eyes flick toward the shed, not disapproving, just curious. The fox healed slowly. So did the space between them. One morning, she stepped outside to find Elias standing near the fence, staring out toward the horizon. He turned his head slightly when he heard her behind him. "Spring's late this year," he said. It was the first full sentence he'd spoken to her in days. She nodded, pulling her shawl tighter. "It usually island." He didn't answer. But for a moment, they stood side by side in the cold light, watching the world hold its breath beneath a blanket of snow. And somewhere behind them, the fox curled its tail around its mending leg and slept, safe for now, in a world where small kindnesses still mattered. The thaw had not yet come, but the days were lengthening. The cold no longer bit as fiercely, though snow still blanketed the ridge like a shroud. Inside the cabin, the fire burned steady, and the spaces between Elias and Martha Jane, once filled with awkward quiet, had grown more comfortable. Not close, not yet, but no longer cold. They moved around each other with unspoken rhythm, like two trees learning, slowly, how to bend toward one another without breaking. One afternoon, while Elias was away checking his traps, Martha Jane knelt near her trunk. She hadn't opened it in weeks. The scent of lavender sachet and old cloth rose as she lifted the lid. Folded dresses she'd never had occasion to wear lay beneath a yellowed Bible, a worn hairbrush, and an envelope that had been bent and unbent too many times. She pulled the letter from its place and unfolded it slowly. "To the man I was promised," it began, in her careful hand. The ink was faded now. She had written it back in Missouri, days before boarding the stage to Redemption Ridge. It was full of hope, then hope laced with fear, but hope nonetheless. Words about being loyal, about keeping a home, about wanting to be chosen for something more than usefulness. The kind of words that didn't matter to men like Carl Tillman. The letter had never been sent. He had never deserved it. Her fingers trembled as she read the lines again, and when she reached the bottom, she noticed the page had torn near the fold. A jagged split, right through the word "worthy." Her breath caught. She clutched the letter to her chest, and the tears came hard this time, heavier than she expected. Not the quiet crying of her first nights in the cabin, but the kind that shakes the body and makes the throat ache. She sat back on her heels and wept. The door creaked open minutes later, the cold rushing in like a whisper. She wiped her eyes quickly, but Elias had already seen. He didn't speak. He set the rabbits he'd caught on the table, brushing snow from his shoulders, and stood there a moment longer, watching. Then he turned away without a word and hung his coat by the fire. That night, after she'd banked the coals and blown out the lantern, Martha Jane found something resting at the foot of her cot, a bundle wrapped in canvas twine. She knelt and opened it slowly. Inside were 6 pieces of parchment, clean, thick, and flat. Beneath them, a small tin of charcoal pencils, some sharpened, others worn down by use but still good. Her breath caught again, but for a different reason now. She looked toward the bed across the room. Elias lay with his back to her, blanket pulled high, motionless. She didn't say thank you, not out loud, but she sat by the fire and drew until the last ember faded, her fingers black with soot and her heart soothed by the sound of pencil on paper. She began sketching more after that, not just the fox, not just the trees. She drew his boots by the hearth, his coat hanging on the peg, the axe he favored for splitting pine. And then, one night, she drew his face not as the town saw him, grizzled and grim, but how she'd come to know it. Lined, yes, and weathered, but steady, strong, and not as alone as it once was. She didn't show him the drawing. She kept it tucked in her trunk behind the Bible. But the next morning, when Elias passed her at the table, his voice was softer than usual. "Need more parchment?" She met his gaze for a breath. "Not yet," she said. He gave a single nod and stepped outside, letting the door fall gently shut behind him. And in the stillness that followed, Martha Jane stared at the parchment in her hand, the lines of his face etched in charcoal and memory, and wondered if maybe the letter she'd once written had found its way to the right man after all. The storm arrived swift and mean, rolling down from the northern pass like a beast with claws. Snow came first, fat, heavy flakes that silenced the forest, followed by wind so fierce it howled through the trees and rattled the cabin shutters. Elias had secured the lean-to earlier, bracing the roof and covering the stacked firewood, but even his sure hands couldn't still the storm's fury. Inside, the fire glowed bright, casting long shadows along the log walls. Martha Jane stitched by candlelight, her needle steady, though her eyes kept drifting toward Elias. He sat in his usual chair near the hearth, a bottle in hand, shoulders slumped farther than usual. The storm's weight seemed to press down on him, not the snow, but something older, something stored deep beneath that weathered skin. He rarely drank, and when he did, it was only a few sips, just enough to warm the belly. But tonight was different. The cork had rolled across the floor an hour ago, and the bottle was near empty. Martha watched, silent, as he stared into the fire with eyes that saw something long gone. She said his name once soft, just above a whisper. He didn't answer. Then he stood suddenly, too fast, and the chair scraped against the floor. He took one step toward the hearth and faltered. His knee buckled, and he collapsed beside the fire with a thud that made Martha leap to her feet. The bottle clattered away and spun in a slow circle before coming to rest near the hearthstones. Elias. She was at his side in an instant, her hands beneath his shoulders, trying to lift him. He was too heavy. She pulled a blanket down from the cot and tucked it over him, brushing his damp hair from his brow. His skin burned with heat, and his breath came in labored gasps. She wet a cloth and dabbed at his temples, whispering words that meant nothing but carried the shape of care. Then he spoke, not to her, not even to the room, but to someone long gone. Lena, Caleb, no, not the fire. Too late. Martha froze. His voice cracked with something more than pain, regret so deep, it scraped bone. He groaned again, shifting beneath the blanket. They burned. I couldn't. I wasn't there. I wasn't there. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, unbidden. She had known there was sorrow in him, felt it in the silence, seen it in the way he never let his guard drop. But now it had a shape, a name, two names. Lena, Caleb. The storm raged through the night. She stayed beside him, changing the cloth when it cooled, whispering when he cried out. He slept in fits, sweat beading on his brow, and by morning the worst of the fever had broken. While he slept, Martha tended the fire and boiled water for tea. Her hands moved without thought, but her mind remained caught on those names, those words. They burned. Later that day, when Elias stepped outside to check the damage, she found herself drawn toward the hearth. The trunk sat near it, same as always, locked tight. But the key, small and brass, was hanging now on a nail just above. Whether he'd placed it there in a moment of forgetfulness or quiet consent, she couldn't know. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. The lock opened with a soft click. Inside, beneath a folded military coat and a stack of letters bound with twine, lay a small silver locket. She opened it carefully. On one side, a woman with kind eyes and hair pinned back in soft curls. On the other, a young boy with a crooked smile and a slingshot hung across his chest. The images were faded but clear. Names had no need to be engraved, she already knew. Lena, Caleb. She closed the locket gently and placed it back where it had been, closing the trunk and returning the key to its hook. That evening, Elias returned with snow in his beard and silence in his eyes. He didn't mention the bottle, or the fever, or the locket. But as he passed her by the hearth, he paused. "You kept the fire going," he said. Martha looked up, meeting his eyes. "I reckon it needed tending." He gave a single nod and moved on. But something between them had shifted, quiet as snowfall, deep as buried roots. The mystery of his pain was no longer locked away. It had a voice now, one she had heard with her own ears, and she would not forget it. The snow had melted from the southern ridge, revealing patches of stubborn earth where new green had not yet dared to bloom. The wind still carried the bite of winter, but the sun lingered a little longer each evening, casting gold across the mountainside and softening the edges of the world. Inside the cabin, the fire had been allowed to die low, and Martha Jane sat near the window, sketching the fox, now fully healed, and lounging in a patch of sunlight just beyond the porch. Elias sat across from her, silent as ever, hands resting on his knees, his gaze distant. The past few days, something had changed in him, not in the way he walked or worked, but in the way he held himself. Less like a wall, more like a man who'd realized walls could become prisons. He cleared his throat, rough and low, and she looked up. "I suppose you've got questions," he said, not looking at her. Martha set her charcoal down. "Only the ones you feel like answering." He gave a slow nod, staring into the fire's soft glow. "I was gone when it happened," he said. 2 weeks before the end of the war. Got word that my regiment was moving south. Lena begged me not to go, said she had a bad feelin', but I was proud. Foolish. Thought a man couldn't rest till he finished what he started." He paused, voice catching. "While I was gone, there was a storm. Lightning struck the barn. The wind carried it straight to the house. Folks say it went up like kindling. They didn't get out, neither of 'em." Martha's breath hitched. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. "I came back a week later," he continued, his voice hollow. "Found 'em buried on the edge of town. Grave markers were plain. No one had written me. They'd all said it was my fault, that if I'd been there, maybe I could have." He stopped. "Doesn't matter. I didn't fight 'em. Didn't fight anything after that." He leaned back, jaw tight. "I walked into the hills with nothing but a spade and a Bible. Built this cabin with my own hands. Not for living, just to be away. Away from people, from memory, from myself." Outside, the fox stirred, ears twitching toward the cabin as if listening too. "I didn't speak to anyone for 5 years," Elias said. "Didn't need to, didn't want to. Then one day, I came down into town for salt, and I saw you sitting on that church step, eyes full of shame, folks turning away from you like you were a thing to be returned." He finally looked at her, really looked, and I saw myself. The silence that followed was full and heavy, like the stillness before a storm. Martha swallowed the lump in her throat and moved closer, reaching across the small table between them. She set her hand gently on his, her fingers warm against the roughness of his scarred skin. "You're not the ashes, Elias," she said, voice steady. "You're the man who came back." His shoulders fell, and for a moment he closed his eyes. No tears came. He was long past the age when grief could find its way out so easily, but his face softened. A breath escaped him like a man exhaling 10 years of ghosts. And then, almost too quiet to be certain, he whispered, "Thank you." Outside, the wind shifted, the trees swayed, and deep in the forest, where fire once devoured and silence reigned, the first bud of spring curled its way toward the light. The days stretched longer now, and the frost that once clung to the windows like breath began to vanish with the morning Sunday. The snow receded in slow retreat, revealing patches of damp earth and early shoots of green fighting their way skyward. The cabin, once a place of silence and shadows, took on a new kind of stillness, less heavy, more alive, the kind that hummed beneath the surface of shared glances and small routines, the kind that made room for laughter. They had found a rhythm. Elias would rise early and check the traps, but now he invited Martha to come with him. He showed her where to place the snares, how to follow the patterns of rabbit tracks through the thickets, and how to set the tension just right so as not to wound the animal. She listened carefully, her hands steady, her questions soft. Her presence didn't disrupt the woods the way others might. She moved with respect, with care. And Elias, watching her crouch beside a set trail, realized he no longer minded the sound of another's footsteps beside his own. In turn, Martha brought him into the kitchen with her. She showed him how to knead bread, how to work the dough with firm hands, how to let it rest just long enough, how to listen for the hollow sound that meant it was done. The first time he tried, his loaf came out hard as a stone. They both laughed, surprised by the sound of it, surprised by how easy it came. He tried again the next day, and the day after that. At night, they talked. Not much, not deeply, but enough. She told him about the little farm she grew up on in Missouri, about her mother's lilac soap and her father's fiddle playing. He told her about the dog he had as a boy, about the first time he climbed these mountains before the war. There were pauses, sometimes long ones, but those silences no longer pressed down like weight. They breathed in them now, like pauses between verses in a hymn. The fox returned one morning, padding out from the tree line with a curious look in its amber eyes. This time, it wasn't alone. 3 small pups trailed after it, clumsy and wide-eyed. Martha knelt by the porch, hand outstretched. The mother fox did not come closer, but she didn't run either, just watched with quiet trust, her pups tumbling in the brush beside her. Elias stood at the doorway, arms folded, watching too. Later that week, he took wood from the pile and began to build. Martha heard the sawing and came outside to find him working beneath the spruce tree near the slope's edge, where the view of the valley opened wide. He didn't tell her what he was making, but the next morning she found a bench there, sturdy, smooth, the seat polished with care. Beside it sat a bundle of parchment and a fresh stick of charcoal. "I thought maybe you'd like a better place to draw," he said simply. She sat down that evening and sketched the fox and her pups beneath the low-hanging branches. Elias sat nearby, whittling in silence. The breeze carried the scent of pine and thawing earth, and the world felt softer somehow, like it too was waking from a long sleep. And though they never named it, something had shifted. He no longer lived in a tomb, and she no longer existed in waiting. They were no longer just two broken people in the wilderness. They were something else now. Something being built slow and steady, like bread rising in a warm cabin, like a bench carved beneath an old tree, like trust shaped over quiet mornings and wordless companionship. And in that rhythm, something like peace began to take root. The thaw in Redemption Ridge came slower than in the highlands. Mud pooled along the wagon ruts, and wooden porches wept with meltwater as the last of the snow faded into memory. But the thaw stirred more than just the earth. It loosened tongues, too. It began with the preacher's wife, who caught a glimpse of Martha Jane at the general store during the last supply run, bundled in a shawl Elias had sewn from a deer hide. She spoke of it to the baker's daughter, who whispered to the blacksmith's boy, who brought it back to the pews. By week's end, the whole town buzzed with talk. The woman who was left at the altar was living with Elias Boone. At first, it was disbelief, then curiosity, then judgment. That poor girl, trapped up there with that savage. "I heard he don't speak a word to her. Lives with animals, they say. Like a beast." She didn't have much choice, bless her heart. No one else was going to take her. Judge Wells overheard the talk during a church gathering and rubbed his jaw with slow thought. He'd known Elias Boone since before the war, known him as a silent, hard man who lived by a code older than Scripture. He hadn't expected him to offer shelter, much less companionship, and yet he had. The preacher, Reverend Amos, stood quiet during the gossip, but his eyes narrowed, not with disapproval, but with something like wonder. He'd seen Martha Jane once from afar, standing beside Elias's wagon as they loaded sacks of grain and candles. She hadn't looked afraid. She'd looked steady. Still, rumors had a way of spreading faster than truth, especially when they rode on the wings of boredom. The loudest whisper came from the corner of the saloon, where travelers rested and men with money spoke louder than most. Clayton Brigg, a land baron with gold teeth and boots too clean for the ridge, sat at a card table sipping rye and listening with half interest until the word "untouched land" caught his ear. "Boone, is it?" he asked the merchant who'd mentioned the name. "Lives up the North Ridge?" "That's the one. Keeps to himself. Cabin built back before the war. No road touches it. No rail. Neither. Just forest and game. Old hunting paths." Brigg's smile was slow and knowing. A man sits on land that long, he starts thinking it's part of him. But paper don't lie. He leaned back in his chair and lit a cigar, smoke curling upward like ambition. "I'll ride up that way soon. Take a look around. Maybe knock on his door if he remembers how to answer one." His men laughed, but the sound didn't carry far. The ridge wasn't like the East. Land here wasn't just property. It was memory, and Elias Boone's land was soaked in it. Still, Brigg was a man who dealt in ink and signatures, not roots and ghosts, and he had no use for sentiment. As rumors brewed and writers whispered, the town watched the ridge with new interest. Some with pity, some with scorn, and a few like Reverend Amos with quiet, growing concern. They didn't know what was happening up on that mountain, but they would soon. Because Clayton Brigg wasn't just coming for conversation, he was coming for conquest. And the land Elias Boone had once built as a tomb was about to become a battleground. The sound of hooves echoed up the ridge long before the riders appeared. Elias heard them from the slope, where he was checking the line fence near the western edge of the property. He paused, axe in hand, eyes narrowing. No neighbor rode that trail. No friend came with such clatter. Only trouble made that much noise on the approach. By the time he returned to the clearing, they were already there. 3 of them, one in a wide-brimmed black hat, slick coat, and polished boots that didn't belong to these mountains. Clayton Brigg. The other 2 were lean, hard men with pistols at their hips and the kind of posture that spoke of violence held on a leash. Martha stood near the porch, her arms folded, face pale but calm. Elias stepped up beside her, silent, looming. The moment he did, one of Brigg's men reached for his belt, but Brigg lifted a hand to stay him. "Easy now, gents. We're just here for a little conversation." He dismounted with theatrical ease and brushed invisible dust from his coat. "Mr. Boone," he said, smiling like a man offering rotten fruit, "you've got yourself a fine piece of land up here, untouched, wild, prime for a new line I'm bringing through the valley." Elias said nothing. His gaze didn't waver. Brigg chuckled. "Now, I don't expect you to be a man of business, so I brought the paperwork." He pulled a folded document from his coat and waved it once before tossing it toward Elias's boots. "Deed says this land's mine now, transferred fair and legal, filed in Carson last week." Elias didn't bend to pick it up. "You know this cabin sits just outside the surveyed boundary of town jurisdiction," Brigg continued, "and the previous claims weren't properly filed after the war. That's what my men found. Simple oversight, I'm sure." Elias finally spoke, voice low and even. "That paper's a lie." Brigg tilted his head. "Lie or law, what matters is who's holding it when the judge knocks his gavel." Martha stepped forward. "You can't just take what don't belong to you." Brigg's eyes slid to her with something between amusement and disdain. "And you must be the mail-order bride." He said it like an insult. "Didn't figure you'd last the winter. But here you are, dressed in homespun and all." He looked to his men. "They've gone and played house." Elias's fists clenched at his sides. "You got 2 weeks," Brigg said, voice cooling. "Then we come back, with more men, with law behind us." He turned, but not before giving a nod to one of his guns. The man disappeared inside the cabin for less than a minute. When he returned, he held a handful of parchment Martha's drawings, her sketches of the fox, the trees, the mountain view, and the one of Elias, face caught in charcoal, quiet and strong. "No sense lettin' memories keep folks rooted," Brigg said, flicking ash from his cigar as his man tucked the drawings into his coat. "Sometimes it helps to clear the walls before you knock 'em down." Elias took a single step forward. Both guns drew in unison. Brigg held up a finger. Now. Wouldn't want to do anything rash. Like I said, 2 weeks. Then we take it all." They rode off without another word. Snow kicked up behind their horses. Martha watched until they disappeared into the trees, her fists clenched at her sides, eyes wet with rage and helplessness. Elias knelt beside the discarded deed, picked it up, and looked it over. His jaw tightened. "They forged the seal," he muttered. "Crude work, but enough for a crooked clerk." Martha stood beside him. "They took my drawings." Elias didn't answer. He rose slowly and stared down the trail the riders had taken. The cold wind stirred his coat, and behind him, the cabin looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable than it ever had. He turned to Martha, voice like gravel. "We're not giving it up." She didn't need to ask what he meant. They were staying, and Brigg had just declared war. The sun was high when Martha Jane and Elias rode into Redemption Ridge. The road had dried into hardened mud, scattered with wagon ruts and hoof prints, but the town was quiet as they passed too quiet. Storefronts that usually hummed with trade and idle talk now hushed at their approach. Curtains twitched. Men leaned against posts with crossed arms, eyes narrowed. A few women turned their backs, whispering behind gloved hands. The sight of them together, her, broad-shouldered and proud, and him, scarred and grim, sent a ripple through the dusty street like the warning of a coming storm. They tied their horses near the chapel and walked toward its white doors. Elias walked slightly behind her, hands at his sides, boots heavy against the wooden boards. Martha's heart pounded, but her spine stayed straight. She was not the same woman who had arrived months ago with trembling hands and lowered eyes. She had faced winter and silence. She had planted bread in barren soil and drawn beauty from ash, and she had been seen, not judged, not weighed, but seen for the first time in her life. The chapel was already half full, murmurs echoing between the walls. At the front stood Preacher Amos, tall and gray-bearded, his eyes calm behind round spectacles. The judge sat near the front pew. A few ranchers flanked the walls. Mothers hushed children as the pair entered. Martha stepped forward before anyone could speak. Her voice, when it rang out, was clear and steady. "You all know who I am," she began, eyes sweeping the room. "And you know what was done to me when I got off that coach. Left there like freight nobody claimed. Most of you looked the other way. Some of you laughed. I don't forget it, not because I want to hold it over you, but because I want you to understand the difference." She turned slightly, gesturing toward Elias, who stood silent by the door, his shadow long across the chapel floor. "This man, this so-called recluse, this scarred-up mountain ghost, you all feared, he gave me what none of you did." She paused. "He gave me dignity when the world gave me shame." A murmur rippled through the pews. Someone cleared their throat. A woman dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "I ain't here asking for charity," Martha continued. "We came to speak truth. Clayton Brigg came to our land with a lie in his hand and 2 guns at his back. He says he owns the ridge now, says he'll take it. But that place isn't just land. It's memory. It's home, and I won't see it stolen." Preacher Amos stepped forward then, his voice deep as riverbed stone. "I've walked that ridge myself," he said. "I've seen what's been built there, not just walls and fences, but peace, quiet redemption, the kind we preach about but seldom live." He turned to the congregation. "Let it be known in this house that the land Elias Boone holds is sacred. It was bought not with coin but with blood, with grief, with the long walk of a man returning from death. No man, no baron with a stamp, has the right to take it." A few stood in agreement. The blacksmith's wife, the apothecary, old Sheriff Green, whose badge no longer shone as bright as it once had. But others stayed seated, eyes flicking nervously toward the saloon, toward the hills, toward the imagined shadow of Brigg's wrath. "What if he comes down on all of us?" one man muttered. "Burns us out like he promised." "Then, let him try," Preacher Amos said, voice firm. "Let him see what faith looks like when it stands on its feet." The room was divided, half heart-stirred, half still sunken in fear. But Martha saw what mattered. The tide had begun to shift. Not all would follow, but some would, and maybe that was enough. As they stepped out into the light again, Elias turned to her. "You spoke well," he said, low. Martha looked up at the sky, clear and wide above the chapel steeple. "We're not alone anymore," she said, and for the first time Elias nodded with something close to hope. The sky darkened a little earlier each evening, not with winter's cold, but with a strange tension that hung in the air like thunder that refused to break. Redemption Ridge was no longer quiet. Each day, something new stirred the dust, another rider in town, another whispered conversation behind the mercantile, another hammer striking wood at the edge of the ridge. Brigg had begun hiring. Men with hard eyes and southern drawls loitered near the saloon, their coats too fine, their boots too clean for honest work. They didn't come to pray or plant. They came to lean against posts and stare. Elias said little about them, but his jaw stayed tighter each day. His eyes were always on the horizon, and the rifle stayed propped behind the door whether they were home or not. Martha noticed the way he moved around the cabin, now more watchful, more alert, as though expecting something to snap. But he kept his hands busy, and that was his answer to fear. He began repairing the old mill by the creek. It hadn't turned since the war, its paddles broken, and its roof collapsed inward like a forgotten lung. But Elias rebuilt it slowly, cutting beams from fallen pine, crafting joints by hand. He never said why, but Martha understood. The land had given him a second life. He meant to give something back. She, too, found her hands fuller each week. A group of children from town began coming up on Saturdays, sent by mothers who remembered what she said in the chapel. They arrived on foot or by cart, carrying slates and scrap paper, giggling shyly. Martha greeted each one with a smile and spread out the bundle of charcoal and ink on the porch table. She taught them how to hold the pencil, how to let the lines breathe, how to see what was already there before trying to draw it. They drew foxes and trees, stars and shadows. They drew the mountain. One girl drew Elias, standing tall with a hat low over his eyes and a soft-shaped Martha beside him. The children laughed, and Elias, watching from the workbench, shook his head with the ghost of a smile. But beneath the laughter, the storm brewed. Briggs' men moved like wolves in daylight, mapping roads, measuring steps. Word spread that he planned to bring the rail through the valley force titles from landowners, push through the forest and run steel where soil had only known root and bone. Most men would have folded under the weight of that kind of money. Most, but not all. Then came the night when everything changed. It was just past dusk. The foxes had curled in their den, and the fire had begun to settle in the hearth. Martha was washing out the last of the cups when a knock came, not loud, but steady. Elias reached the door before she could. Outside stood Preacher Amos, flanked by 3 townsfolk, Mrs. Dunley from the bakery, her apron still dusted in flour, young Thomas Green, the sheriff's boy, carrying a sack of nails, and the widow Bellamy with a bundle of blankets in her arms. Behind them, more figures approached, walking up the path in 2s and 3s, neighbors who had once looked away. Some brought lumber, others had bread, seed packets, tools. One man held a coil of rope and a jug of kerosene, not for burning, but for lanterns, for building, for staying. No one spoke at first. Then Preacher Amos stepped forward. Thought you could use a few hands. Elias looked at the crowd, stunned but unmoving. Martha came to his side, eyes wide with quiet disbelief. I didn't ask for this, Elias said. You didn't have to, the preacher replied. Sometimes a man's life speaks louder than his voice ever could. Someone lit a lantern, then another. The porch glowed in warm gold. Children pointed to their drawings pinned on the cabin wall. Martha blinked back tears. The town was choosing. Not everyone. Not yet. But enough to make a stand. And above them all, the wind stirred the pines, as if whispering that change was coming. The kind no man, no baron could buy off, or bury. The storm was gathering, but this time they wouldn't weather it alone. The fire was spotted just after sundown. Smoke poured over the southern slope in thick black coils, and the acrid scent of burning pine filled the air like a curse spoken aloud. Martha was the first to notice it, rising from the porch bench, charcoal still smudged on her fingertips, her eyes narrowing toward the creek. The mill, she whispered, and Elias was already moving. They ran. The wind funneled the flames upward, hungry and bright, casting flickering light across the trees as they crested the hill. The rebuilt paddles Elias had carved by hand were already engulfed, snapping and twisting like bones in a furnace. Sparks leapt skyward, carried on gusts that hissed and howled. Heat pulsed in waves, and somewhere near the edge of the clearing, a scream pierced the smoke. "Ada!" Martha cried, recognizing the voice. The little girl, no more than 9, had come with her brothers earlier that day to bring eggs, and had likely wandered toward the creek, as children do, curious and unthinking. Now she stood near the far bank, trapped by the flames, her eyes wide with terror, her foot twisted beneath her. Without a word, Elias charged into the smoke, coat drawn over his face. Martha circled wide, calling to Ada, who cried out again, coughing and stumbling. Elias reached her first, scooping her into his arms and shielding her with his body as a burning beam cracked and fell behind them. The path back was closing. Martha caught up, coughing, eyes stinging. Together they moved, slow and heavy, Elias bearing both the child and the weight of smoke-laced air. Just as they neared the tree line, 3 men stepped into view. Briggs' men, recognizable by the arrogance in their posture and the glint of steel at their hips. One of them raised a pistol. "That's far enough," he sneered. Elias didn't flinch. He passed Ada into Martha's arms and stepped forward, his hands bare and open, his breath rasping. "You set the fire," he said. "Just a warning," the man replied. "Seems you ain't taken Briggs' offer serious." Elias said nothing. He moved like a bear through brush, sudden, brutal, and silent. The first man didn't have time to draw. Elias slammed into him with a grunt, sending him crashing into a tree. The second swung a rifle like a club, catching Elias across the shoulder, but the mountain man barely faltered. He grabbed the weapon, twisted it free, and used the stock like a hammer. The third ran before the fight even reached him. When it was over, Elias stood bleeding from a gash at his brow, smoke curling around him like the steam of battle past. Martha clutched Ada, who sobbed softly into her shawl. Behind them, the mill collapsed inward, embers rising like stars. By morning, the story had reached every corner of Redemption Ridge. Preacher Amos rang the church bell at midday, not for a sermon, but for justice. The town gathered, wary and murmuring, the scent of smoke still fresh on their coats. Elias stood beside the preacher. Martha stood just behind, hands clasped, face calm. Brig arrived late, his coat spotless, his silver buttons gleaming. He wore the smugness of a man used to being obeyed. "You summoned me?" he asked, feigning politeness. "We did," Amos replied. "You'll show your claim here and now, and answer for the fire that nearly killed a child." Brig scoffed. "You can't prove nothing. That ridge ain't yours to defend." Amos raised a worn hand. "Then prove it's yours to take." A hush fell. The people waited. The mill was gone, but the truth stood tall in the ashes. And the town, divided no longer, stood ready to hear it. The town hall was packed shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with sweat and tension, as though the timber walls themselves were holding their breath. Rain tapped lightly on the windows, a soft rhythm against the storm inside. Men stood at the back, arms crossed, while women clutched shawls and murmured behind their hands. No one laughed. No one smiled. All eyes were on the front, where a long table had been set like an altar of reckoning. Judge Wells sat at its center, spectacles low on his nose, the lines on his face drawn tight with fatigue. Preacher Amos stood off to the side, hands clasped before him. Martha Jane sat in the second row, her chin lifted, calm beneath her bonnet. Beside her, Elias Boone stood tall, still as a stone, scarred and silent. Behind him, his land, his life, his story, now laid bare to a room full of those who had once called him mad. Clayton Briggs swaggered to the front with a smirk carved deep into his ruddy face. His coat was pressed, his boots shined. He held a folded deed like a torch and laid it before the judge. "There it is," he declared, tapping it with his finger, signed, sealed, and filed in Carson. Elias Boone's claim was never recorded proper. The land's gone fallow long enough for new hands to work it. That's the law. Wells unfolded the document, squinted through his lenses, and frowned. "This seal's smudged." "It's official," Briggs snapped. "Paper don't lie." "Wait." Murmurs rippled through the hall. Elias didn't move. Martha rose then, calmly, her voice low but clear. "Your paper may not lie, but it don't tell the truth either." All heads turned. She stepped forward, hand reaching into her satchel. From within it, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with cord, she produced a faded envelope. She laid it on the table, unfolded it, and pushed it toward the judge. "I found this in Elias's trunk. It's from the War Department, signed after he returned from service, granting him the land in perpetuity for valor, for what he gave up while fighting for the Union." Judge Wells took the paper, his eyes widening as he read. His hand trembled slightly. "This seal," he murmured, "is genuine." Briggs' mouth twitched. "That don't mean—" "It means," Wells cut in, voice rising for the first time, "that this land was awarded by federal order, recorded before your name ever inked a line on that paper of yours, which makes your deed void, possibly criminal." Briggs' face turned red, and he slammed a fist on the table. "You think you can steal my investment from under me with some old letter and a widow's sympathy speech? I'll take this to Carson. I'll bring men back who don't care about dusty sermons or mountain ghosts." That was when Elias stepped forward. His boots echoed once on the wooden floor, then again. He stood before the room, broad and quiet, but when he spoke, his voice filled every corner. "This is my land," he said, thunder in his tone. "My home. I built it with hands that came back from war shaking and empty. I buried the life I lost beneath its soil. I protected it when there was nothing left in me worth protectin'." End quote. He turned slightly, eyes locking with Martha's. "And she is my wife." A silence fell so complete, even the rain outside seemed to pause. Preacher Amos stepped forward. "You heard the man." Brig opened his mouth, but whatever words came died in the shadow of the town, rising to its feet one by one. The baker, the blacksmith, the widow, even the sheriff's son. And Brigg, who had come with a pen and a threat, found himself alone in a room full of truth. It was not the land that had been judged today. It was the man trying to steal it. And Redemption Ridge, once divided, now stood firm. Morning light spilled over the ridge in soft gold, painting the town hall's wooden floor with long, warm shadows. The storm had passed. The air felt lighter than it had in weeks, cleansed by truth, stirred by courage. Brigg stood in the center of the room, red-faced and pacing, his bluster now unraveling. The deed that once gave him power now sat discarded on the judge's table, like a snake shed of its skin. He opened his mouth again, ready to speak, to shout, to threaten when the doors to the hall swung open. A man stepped inside, in a long duster, dust still clinging to his boots, his badge gleaming beneath his coat. The room hushed instantly. Marshal Theo Granger wasn't a man known for small talk. Broad-shouldered and quiet-eyed, he carried the weight of authority like a hammer not yet swung. He stepped forward without acknowledging the gasps or the stares. In his hand was a folded telegram. "Got a wire from Preacher Amos," the marshal said plainly, voice carrying like a bell across the wood-planked floor. "Said a man down here forged land papers and lit fire to property with folks still on it." Briggs scoffed, but it caught in his throat. "I did no such." The marshal held up the telegram, then pointed to Judge Wells. "You recognize that seal?" "I do," Wells replied. "War Department. Original grant. Elias Boone's by right." "And the deed?" Granger asked. "Forged," Wells said without hesitation. "Filed out of jurisdiction. And the signature sloppy work." Granger turned to Brigg. "Clayton Brigg, you're under arrest for fraud, unlawful claim, and conspiracy to commit arson. You'll answer to a federal judge in Carson." Brigg laughed nervously, raising his hands. "Now, wait just a—" But the marshal wasn't waiting. In one swift motion, he stepped forward and twisted Briggs' arm behind his back, fitting iron cuffs to his wrists. Briggs' protests rang out, high and brittle, echoing off the beams like the calls of a crow losing its perch. "You can't do this. This town don't own me." "No," Granger said coolly, "but the law does." A cheer broke through the silence, then tentative at first, then louder, swelling like water breaching a dam. The townspeople clapped, whistled, stomped their boots. Someone shouted Elias's name. Someone else shouted Martha's. It became a chorus of triumph, of relief, of long-held guilt giving way to redemption. Elias didn't move at first. He stood still in the rising noise, shoulders heaving once, then again. His face was unreadable. Not from pride, not from anger, but from something deeper, older. Grief, long held beneath the skin, finally stirred. His knees bent slightly as though the weight had all come down at once, and he would have crumpled there, silent and unseen as ever. But Martha was there. She stepped beside him, slid her arm under his, and held him upright. Not like someone saving a man, but like someone anchoring him to the earth. He looked at her, and for the first time in the eyes of the town, Elias Boone smiled. It wasn't wide, it wasn't bright, but it was real. At their feet, the fox trotted in from the doorway and curled beside them, its red coat catching the sun, its body relaxed, as though it too had been waiting for the danger to pass. The marshal led Brigg away in shackles. The people continued to cheer, but Elias and Martha stood quiet amid the noise, still as stones weathered by time, bound not by spectacle, but by the simple, sacred knowledge that justice had come not swift, but sure, and they had stood through the fire together. The thaw came slowly that year, as if the earth itself was unsure it could believe in warmth again. But by the time the last of the ice melted from the creek, soft green had begun to creep across the valley, and the dogwoods near the ridge burst into bloom. White petals like stars clung to every branch, dancing in the wind, and the world smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. On the slope just below the cabin, under the largest of those trees, 2 chairs were set side by side. A patchwork quilt, stitched by the women of the town, lay across one, and a wreath of woven wildflowers crowned the other. Elias stood there in a crisp white shirt, face shaved clean for the first time in years, boots polished until they caught the light. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something deeper, something tender and vast. Next to him, Preacher Amos waited with a small, worn Bible in hand and a smile so soft it barely curved his lips. Then Martha Jane stepped out of the cabin. Her dress was simple and blue, the same blue as the sky that morning, and her hands clutched a bouquet of pine needles, lilies, and charcoal-tinted ribbons. The children gasped at the sight of her. Some clapped. A few of the women wiped tears from their eyes. She walked slowly, each step sure, her chin lifted, her eyes on the man who had once been little more than a shadow on the ridge. Elias met her halfway, and they joined hands beneath the blooming dogwood. Amos spoke few words, only what was needed. "Do you come to each other freely?" he asked. They both nodded. "Do you promise to stand in storm and sun, in silence and song?" They nodded again. And when the vows were spoken, simple and true, the applause was not loud but full. It filled the air like bird song, like the sound of life returning. Afterward, they didn't feast, but there was bread, and cider, and laughter. The townsfolk brought gifts, not of gold or lace, but seeds for the garden, books for the children, nails and hammers, and planks of wood. There was joy in their eyes, but also a reverence for what had been endured, for what had grown where no one had expected. Near the fox's den, Martha opened a crate of slates and chalk, and children gathered around her on stumps and blankets. She spoke to them of trees, of stories, of what could be drawn from the earth and the imagination both. They listened with wide eyes, and some even drew her picture as she spoke, charcoal pressed tight in little hands. Elias, not far off, worked steadily at a new project, wooden beams laid out for a set of swings. His sleeves were rolled up, and he whistled, soft and off-key. He looked up every now and then, just to see her there. Later that day, the preacher took a small wooden plaque and hammered it gently into the dogwood tree beneath which they had Wednesday. It read, "Here, mercy made a home," and it did, in the quiet hum of the wind through the trees, in the echo of children's laughter as they played in the clearing, in the steady rhythm of Elias Boone's hammer and the careful curve of Martha's handwriting in her students' books. It was not a grand life, but it was whole, and it had been built not from comfort, not from ease, but from second chances, from scar tissue, from the kind of love that does not begin with fireworks, but with a door left open and a hand outstretched in the dark. The garden would grow, the children would learn, and the ridge, once feared, was now a place where hope had roots. They say if you listen close on a spring morning in Redemption Ridge, just as the sun spills over the pines and the mist lifts off the valley floor, you can hear the wind telling stories through the dogwoods. The blooms still come in thick each year, white as linen, soft as memory, and beneath them, children sit cross-legged on the grass, their faces tilted upward as the older folks speak in low, reverent tones. They speak of a time not found in books or records, but in the marrow of the town itself, a time when greed rode in on polished boots and nearly took everything, when a man, long thought more myth than flesh, came down from the mountains carrying silence and scars, and when a woman, left behind and laughed at, stood tall in a church and spoke truth so pure it cut through the judgment like a bell in fog. The children know the names: Elias Boone, Martha Jane Boone, the mountain man, and the mail-order bride. They know how he built a cabin high on the ridge to bury his sorrow, and how she brought light to it not with noise or fury, but with quiet hands and an unwavering heart. They know how she taught the town's children to draw with charcoal and courage, and how he built swings from cedar that still creak in the wind. They've seen the garden she planted still blooming with wild lavender and foxglove and the old mill wheel, now painted with their handprints. Some say the fox still lives near the tree line, a descendant of the one Martha nursed long ago. It watches from the brush with calm amber eyes, its red coat flashing between branches like a memory that refuses to fade. Others say they've seen Elias himself in the distance at dusk, just beyond the clearing, still tall and strong, watching over the land he gave everything to protect. The cabin still stands, its timbers worn smooth by time and touch. The plaque nailed into the dogwood hasn't rusted. Here, mercy made a home, it reads, and every child who sits beneath that tree learns what those words mean. They learn that strength isn't in the loudest voice or the fastest draw, that love doesn't always begin with beauty or fire, but with choosing someone again and again, even when the world has looked the other way. They learn that broken things can be mended, and that what grows from ash can sometimes be stronger than what stood before. On cool evenings, Preacher Amos's daughter, now gray-haired herself, reads aloud from a book of drawings, Martha's drawings, preserved and bound by loving hands. Pictures of mountains and foxes, of children, of a man in a wide-brimmed hat standing beside a woman whose eyes held the whole sky. And when the wind moves through the valley just right, carrying the scent of pine and smoke and memory, the people of Redemption Ridge remember not just the story, but the lesson it gave them, that no one is too forgotten to be found, no past too scarred to begin again. Up in the mountains, where fire once devoured and sorrow dug deep roots, flowers grow, and they grow still.